Pueblo Deco is really a fusion of two separate styles, Art Deco and Spanish Pueblo Colonial Revival. And those two architectural styles, when put together, include elements that consist of the vertical lines and the futuristic elements and the exterior embellishments of the Art Deco style with the stucco surfaces and the parapets and the vigas and corbels that you see in Spanish Pueblo Revival architecture. I think what really made it unique as Pueblo Deco architecture is that Oresti's vision consisted of adorning every possible square foot with Native American art elements. And so as a result, what you have is the first theater that is a Pueblo Deco style that is specifically dedicated to a Native American art and culture. Well, Oreste and Maria Bakecki envisioned a theater that would be totally covered with designs from Native American culture. And in conceiving the design, they had Carl Bowler and some others, probably Robert Powers and perhaps Pablo Abeta, who traveled around to the Navajo Nation and the various pueblos putting together ideas for designs. And during this time, of course, they had designs that were laid out all over the house, all over the Bakecki house, of ideas for the exterior as well as the interior of the KiMo Theater. And Carl von Hassler was contracted to paint trompe-l'oeil designs on the inside of the theater. It's believed that Pablo Abeta was actually commissioned to oversee the execution of the native designs inside the theater, and particularly probably overseeing the work of two individuals, Inez Westlake and Robert Powers, who were both interior designers. The KiMo Theater was named by Pablo Abeta, who submitted a winning entry in a contest. And he suggested the name KiMo, which are two words that are Pueblo words when put together mean most literally mountain lion and more figuratively king of its kind, or that which cannot be perfected, a concept that works perfectly when you think and see the KiMo Theater. One of the favorite Bakecki family stories is the fact that it was very difficult to get loan money for the construction of the KiMo Theater because supposedly, I shouldn't say supposedly, but the KiMo Theater was built kind of off the beaten path by a couple of blocks. Because we remember that originally, when Newtown developed, that the main drag was Front Street, and Front Street ran north and south, and the city kind of developed in that direction. And through time, that orientation changed so that the orientation became Railroad Avenue and then later what we now know as Central Avenue. And when you think of the KiMo being built on 5th and Central, technically it's a couple of blocks away from where the main drag could have been. And the family's understanding was that this created a problem for the bankers. And of course, as we all know, Albuquerque, developed right along Central Avenue, and now here we are in the 1920s, and then later in the 1930s and 40s, when the KiMo's in its heyday, sitting right on Central and 5th. One favorite family story is that the Bakeckis had difficulties at certain times pulling together the money that they needed in order to get the construction loan for the KiMo Theater, because their concerns were that the theater location was located off the beaten path, a little bit far from Central Avenue and First, when at the time it was thought that the city was going to move in a more northerly and southerly direction. Of course, as we now know, the KiMo Theater sits right at 5th and Central, right on the main drag, and in its heyday, it sat right on Route 66. Well, opening night must have been really fantastic because the information that was presented in that day's newspaper, the New Mexico State Tribune, for September 19th, 1927, it was a blowout. Every page talked about the KiMo Theater. It was full of exciting ads from the different companies who participated, full descriptions of opening night. And of course, the opening program was chock full of different events. It was such an exciting night that over 2,000 people showed up at the KiMo, and there were only tickets for about 1,600 at the max, which was the seating capacity. So there were a lot of people who didn't get in on opening night. Now, the different events were really incredible, too. It was billed not only as the first theater dedicated to Native Americans, but it was also the first theater dedicated to the public by Native Americans. So there were over 60 performers that were up on stage that were doing a dramatic reenactment of the creation of the KiMo Theater. And it included a dedication by Pablo Abeta. It included the Cochiti basket and arrow dances in the recreation. And then they moved on to some of the featured films. It included cartoons of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit by Walt Disney, a Fox newsreel, and then the feature film Painting the Town by Patsy Ruth Miller and Glenn Tryon. So it was a really incredible night. And there were lots of incredible nights like that at the KiMo Theater. The public would just throng. They would form huge crowds in the front when favorite movies were held and when theater productions were cast. So the crowds would get really excited going to the KiMo Theater, and they would all come out to see their favorite movies. One woman even told me a story about how they would hide children under their mother's skirts, their mother's long, full skirts, in order to get them into the theater for free. It's been said by one city official that the lowest form of preservation for a historic building is to be torn down and turned into a parking lot. And on the other hand, the highest order of preservation would be to take a building and not only restore it to its original beauty, but restore it to its original function. And that's what the people of Albuquerque have done with the KiMo Theater. I think that another really important thing about the KiMo is also that not only is it a monument to Native art and culture, but it's the only theater that has been dedicated by Native people. And that's really special. I think another thing to remember also is the honor that was given to us when Pablo Abeyta provided and offered the name KiMo Theater, that it is really truly king of its kind. That was a very special name, and that was a very special honor for the KiMo. In essence, the way the program was organized actually did a little bit of myth busting because it presents the Native performers as performers and not just performing within one cultural tradition being their own. Pablo Abeyta, for example, spoke at least 3 languages. Very well-read, educated man. And so it's entirely plausible that the performers were also, world educated as well. And I know that we tend to think of Native communities as being more limited, but by the turn of the century, there were tremendous opportunities. Pablo Abeyta traveled all over the country. There was a large number of people who worked at the KiMo Theater. There were lots of employees. There were people who ran the projection booth. There were ushers and usherettes, people who took tickets, and employees of the restaurants and the cafes and the curio shops. People everywhere. There are lots of great stories that were told by people who ran the projection booth, and also lots of great stories about people who met and married at the KiMo Theater. Well, the KiMo Theater was bustling with activity all of the time. You had productions, you also had rehearsals, and you had a very quick turnover. So there was always something happening here. You had people inside the theater who were here for opening night working. You had people inside the restaurant and the cafe who were also working. Everywhere you went on all floors of the KiMo Theater, there was activity. You had stagehands in the back, electricians, production managers, and in the front you had ushers and usherettes and floor managers and people who were taking money up on the second floor for the patrons who wanted to visit the cry room or the smoking room. Well, opening night consisted of a number of performances, and they all started out with this incredible dedication by the Native American community of the KiMo Theater. And what they did was they participated in a dramatic recreation of the naming of the theater, and there were over 60 participants, and they included some important figures, including Navajo baritone Hasky Naswood and Zuni soprano Margaret Wells. Let me think where I stopped I was talking about Pablo Abeyta being commissioned to oversee the work of 2 interior designers. And they were Robert Powers, who's from LA, and Inez Westlake, who is an interior designer from here in Albuquerque. And the very interesting thing is that just a few years earlier, in 1925, Inez Westlake produced a book of American Indian designs that were taken from the Fred Harvey Fine Arts Collection and the Laboratory of Anthropology in Santa Fe. And so she was drawing from real Native art. And what she did, and it's very clear once you see the book, is that she took those designs and then she incorporated them into select spots in the KiMo Theater. So for example, you have the design on the proscenium curtain that's actually a 19th century Hopi bowl interior featuring a corn maiden, and that is probably an exact reproduction of an actual bowl. One of the most unique things about the design elements that were used in the KiMo Theater is how they were put together in these creative combinations. So for example, on the auditorium wall you have this assemblage of buffalo skulls which speak of the mythology of the Old West and the plains cultures that are combined with the Navajo whirling logs design, which is more of a symbol of happiness and friendship and harmony and abundance, themes that are found in the story.